No, that's right, not Jeff. No, not Jeff. Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we have gone through a terrible and traumatic experience in the last year called a U.S. presidential election. I don't know how many countless people were utterly mortified by this, whether or not their chosen candidate won. Now, as it happened, the candidate whom I voted for lost last Tuesday, but I would be foolish if I ignored the fact that people all across America had a miserable, terrible experience with this presidential election, whether or not their candidate won or lost. And you ask yourself, how could that be? Why don't we cherish the opportunity to choose our national leader? How is it that we've been sucked into this negative vortex of hatred and vilification called choosing a president of the United States? It seems utterly imponderable. I was watching Saturday Night Live just a couple of days before the election, and the Not Hillary actor and the Not Donald actor could agree on only one thing. This is what they said. This whole election has been mean. Don't you guys feel gross all the time about this? And they were speaking to us, not to each other, but they were speaking to us, the American people. And they're right. It is gross. But the question for us is very simple. Does it really have to be that way? Or could we somehow transform this into what it's supposed to be? An exhilarating jubilee revolving around choosing a leader who will make America a better place. But you have to understand that we're in a deep, deep hole here. Both major presidential candidates ended this campaign with deeply negative favorability ratings, so negative they were in double digits. For the past 6 months, it's been a commonplace that both candidates were the most unpopular candidates in the history of presidential polling. About as popular as getting a root canal on your birthday. Now, it's been 13 long years since the Gallup poll indicated that most people in this country thought that the country was heading in the right direction. 13 years. Some Republican leadership, some Democratic leadership, and it all ends up the same way. Most people think the country's heading in the wrong direction. And it's been 13 years, not coincidentally, since a majority of Americans thought that Congress was doing a good job and approved of it. In fact, we reached a nadir during the government shutdown. Only 16% of the country thought we were heading in the right direction, and only 9% of the country thought that Congress was doing a good job. And I pointed out at the time, standing exactly where I'm standing right now, that according to recent polling, Congress was literally less popular than dog poop. In one election after another, the voters feel completely ignored. Literal effort and no effort is made to explain to them how their lives might be improved by any candidates running for office. It's all just an ad hominem, personality-driven crap storm. And people feel that they're left with a choice of choosing between two evils. Well, take it from me. The choice between two evils is evil. Now, one sort of common sense observation when you're left with two major candidates, both of whom are overwhelmingly unpopular, is that part of the problem we face is that almost 80% of the people who are in America and eligible to vote had no part in choosing the candidates. So maybe it should come as no surprise that we end up in a situation like this. I did an interesting poll just 3 days before the election, a national poll, and let me show you what I found regarding how these candidates, the nominees of their parties, stacked up against other alternative opponents. Let me show you. let's play fantasy politics for a few minutes. If the matchup had been President Obama versus Donald Trump, President Obama would have won by 2% of the vote. If the matchup had been Bill Clinton versus Donald Trump, Bill Clinton would have won with 4% of the vote. If the matchup had been Joe Biden, the vice president, versus Donald Trump, Biden would have won by 8% of the vote. And if the matchup had been Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump, as reported in the Huffington Post recently, Bernie Sanders would have won by 12% of the vote. Note one thing. Every single alternative candidate performed better than the actual candidate who was the nominee of my party in these matchups. Also note that you can't possibly attribute that only to the negativity of the campaign, because frankly, there have been a few hard knocks over the years against Barack Obama, and against Bill Clinton, and against Joe Biden, and against Bernie Sanders. Let's play some more fantasy politics. Let's look at alternative opponents against Hillary Clinton. Now, bear in mind that according to the current results, although Hillary Clinton lost the presidential election, she nevertheless won the popular vote by around 1% of the vote as I speak to you tonight. Let's take a look at what would have happened if she'd been pitted against alternative Republican candidates. Hillary Clinton would have lost to Ted Cruz in the popular vote by 4%. Hillary Clinton would have lost to George W. Bush by 8%. She would have lost to Marco Rubio by 10%, Mitt Romney by 12%, and she would have lost to the Speaker of this House, Paul Ryan, by 14%. Again, note one thing that draws all of these matchups together. The fact that the candidate who actually was the nominee of his party would have done worse against any alternative opponent. And the candidate who would have been the nominee of her party would have done worse against any alternative opponent that was tested here. Let's continue. Just for those who are curious, if neither of the candidates had been nominated by their parties, we would have had some interesting matchups. I'll just give you 3 examples here. I told you already that Senator Sanders would have defeated Donald Trump by 12 points. He would have defeated Ted Cruz by 10 points. He would have defeated Marco Rubio by 4 points. Interesting matchups all. But here's the thing. The fact is that the great majority of Americans had no choice at all in selecting the candidates whom we ended up voting for. We might consider it somehow a good thing that 58 million Americans actually voted in the presidential primaries, until we consider that 191 million Americans did not. Our grievances as a country and our divisions are massive, deep, intractable, and widely shared. And that makes me wonder whether we can declare our independence from a system that constantly and perpetually generates unappealing and frankly sometimes appalling alternatives. We can't go on like this. You know what I'm talking about. As Leonard Cohen said, we all feel like our dog just died. We have to change the way that we do politics in America. Now, I'm not suggesting that we choose our leaders like the Athenians did. They chose their leaders by lottery. I'm not suggesting that we adopt Jonathan Swift's suggestions, but I agree with him that people are the riches of a nation. And I'm not going to suggest sitting it out. I realize the temptation. I've heard so many people say over the years, don't vote, it only encourages them. But I think that's wrong. What we need is a better political system that actually manifests itself in a more positive way and leads to a choice between candidates who, imagine, we respect, we admire, we look up to, as they engage in a battle of ideas and principles, not a battle of personalities and personal attacks. I'm also not going to suggest that an answer would be a third party. If there's one thing that's clear, the two parties we have aren't functioning that well. I'm not sure that a third party is likely to make much of a difference. And I don't think that we're likely to see a messiah running for the third party as a presidential candidate when one we had this year couldn't even tell us what Aleppo was. It's a good thing nobody asked him what a hen weighs. The answer is 4 to 6 pounds. I think what's missing, after giving this a great deal of thought for the past week, is something very simple. We Americans desperately need and deserve the right to reject all of the candidates on the ballot. Now, I realize that that's an unusual notion, but I want you to think about it, because I'm introducing a bill called the None of the Above Act, whereby if the last line of the ballot, none of the above, gets more votes than any candidate does, then none of the above actually wins. I'm not talking about the Nevada version that we already have, where the none of the above vote gets ignored. I'm talking about none of the above winning and forcing a mulligan, a do-over. We make them do it over until they get it right, and give us candidates who we want to vote for, someone who we feel will actually do a good job in leadership and make the country a better place. Now, I want you to know that this is not unprecedented. I want you to know that in communist Poland, none of the above actually crossing the candidate's name off the ballot, which is a version of none of the above, defeated the prime minister in 1989. And in 1991, 200 candidates for the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies were defeated the same way. So if the end of communism isn't enough to motivate you for favoring this reform, here are some more benefits. First, and most importantly, we eliminate the need, the terrible need, to try to choose between the lesser of two evils. I will remember the Louisiana governor's race 25 years ago, when we were forced to choose in Louisiana between corrupt Edward Edwards and racist David Duke. Do you remember the bumper stickers that said, "Vote for the crook, it's important"? Now, according to a poll at that time, 2/3 of Louisiana voters wished they could have voted for neither, for none of the above. And they were right. They were right. If primary voters haven't identified the best candidates for the job, not just decent candidates, but actually the best candidates for the job, the general election voters should be able to wave their fingers and say, no way. I'm not going for that until you convince we, the people, that you're the best candidate for the job. Then we're going to insist on other choices until we find somebody who is. Now, this will have a wonderful effect, a very important effect, on what we saw drenching us, this tsunami of negative advertising and negative campaigning that we saw on our TV screens and now on our computer screens and even our phones. This incessant drumbeat of negative campaigning. Why? Because both sides will understand that if you indulge yourself that way, all you're doing is driving down votes below none of the above and elevating none of the above your candidate. Let's replace this terrible, malignant notion of vote against him, vote against her, with something called vote for me, and here's why. Here's what I will do to improve your life. What am I going to do for you, not what am I going to do to you? Now, in addition to that, I see a big boost in turnout. Last time I checked, which was a few days ago, the total number of votes in the 2016 presidential election was lower than the total number of votes in the 2012 presidential election, and the 2008 presidential election, and the 2004 presidential election. As of a few days ago, you had to go all the way back to 2000 to find any national presidential election where fewer people voted. And here's the really strange thing. Back in 2000, we had 40 million fewer Americans. I think there's a lot of people who show up for the specific purpose of voting for none of the above. I think we'll see a massive increase in turnout if we simply convey to people the right to reject all the candidates, which is exactly how they feel. In addition to that, we'll be keeping elected officials on their toes. 90% of the elected officials in this body, the House of Representatives, face uncompetitive races time after time after time. 2/3 of all the races down the hall in the Senate are uncompetitive. When members of Congress represent deep red or deep blue districts, they often run unopposed, and they win with 100% of the so-called vote, which isn't really a vote at all. So knowing that no matter what kind of district they are, red, blue, purple, no matter whom they represent, they will be facing none of the above on that ballot, will put the fear of God in them. And we need to do that. We need to make sure that the comfortable here in this room and down the hall aren't too comfortable, and that even pampered incumbents in gerrymandered districts would have to work diligently to defeat the specter of none of the above. Also, we clearly need to defeat the dictatorship of the primary voters. As I indicated before, 58 million American adults voted in the primary elections, and 191 million did not. And what was the result of that? People who were deeply dissatisfied with the choices that they had. Let me show you what I mean. Two days before the presidential election, I asked in a national poll, how do you feel about those presidential primary elections? How do you feel about them? Almost 52% said they were disappointed. Only 48% said that they were pleased. And interestingly enough, that sentiment of disappointment was widely shared. Among Democrats, 38% said that they were disappointed. Among Republicans, 53% said that they were disappointed. Among independents, who in many states didn't even have the legal right to vote to choose a presidential candidate in either party, 69% said that they were disappointed. And that explains, in part, why we end up with a terrible Hobson's choice on the ballot. Above all, though, to be able to choose none of the above on each federal ballot would show respect for the voters. In my state, the state of Florida, the Constitution of the state begins with these words: all political power is inherent with the people. If you really believe that in your heart, if you believe that the sovereign in this country, the royalty in this country, are the people of the United States, the voters, then how can you possibly explain to them why we wouldn't allow them to reject all the candidates? Now, this is a practical proposal. I don't know how many people have noticed this, but we have more than 2 months between the election and when the president is sworn in under the 20th Amendment. We have almost 2 months between the election and when the House of Representatives and the Senate are sworn in here in this building. It's not that difficult to put on a new election within 2 months. I know a lot of people who would favor having elections that take place in less than 2 months instead of approaching 2 years. In fact, it would be a blessed relief. Now, I understand that most people who are elected officials would want to fight against this for their own selfish purposes. In fact, one of the liberating elements of the fact that I will be leaving this body in a couple of months, I'll be leaving because I was defeated. I'll be leaving this body, and that gives me the freedom to be able to do and say what is right and not what is for my own personal benefit. But I will point out that many, many, many people across the country believe that term limits are a good thing, and that somehow or another term limits have been maneuvered through the Florida legislature and the legislature of many other states. And of course, term limits limit the terms of elected officials. So in the same sense, if term limits could ever be enacted anywhere, that shows that it is possible to actually put a choice in the ballot like none of the above that doesn't favor any elected official anywhere ever, but favors instead the voters and gives them a right that they should have, but they don't have. Now, in case you're curious, you may wonder, what would have happened a week ago last Tuesday if we've had that choice on the ballot? I know, and I'd like to show you. According to my poll, 40% of the American people would have voted a week ago last Tuesday for none of the above. 60% would have chosen a candidate, and if you delve further into it, you would see that of those 60%, 28% would have voted for Hillary Clinton, 27% would have voted for Donald Trump, 4% would have voted for the third-party candidate put up by the Libertarians, and 1% would have voted for the third-party candidate put up by the Green Party. In short, and think about what this really means, none of the above would have won. None of the above would have won. And we would have the choice that human dignity suggests we should have, a choice involving new candidates to decide who rules over this nation of 300 million plus people and becomes the leader of the free world. A new set of choices, a better set of candidates, and a brighter future. If we simply can't stand the candidates we've got, we need new ones. Isn't that obvious? Think of it as voting with your middle finger. We deserve this choice. As human beings, as Americans, as people who deserve to have full control over our own sovereign fate, we deserve the choice of none of the above. I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the Chair recognizes the gentleman